Tonight, we're going to drift back in time to uncover the strange, forgotten ways people once tried to sleep. From noble chambers to peasant huts, the night looked very different than it does for us. If you've ever wondered how people found rest in a world without electricity, tonight's story is for you. Close your eyes. Imagine the silence of a medieval castle. Only the flicker of candlelight and the sound of your own breath. Sleep was never just sleep. It was ritual, survival, and sometimes even politics. Before we drift off together, let's wander into the forgotten world of nighttime, where kings turned their beds into thrones, and peasants curled on straw under smoky rafters. If you're still awake, perhaps leave a quiet comment. Tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy drifting through these slow journeys into the past, a gentle tap on subscribe will keep you close for the next story. Maybe share this with a friend who also struggles to fall asleep. History is always better when it's shared. And if you'd like, whisper into the comments what kind of history you'd like to dream through next. Your ideas might guide the next night's story. Imagine for a moment that you are waking up in a small apartment in Moscow during the 1950s. The walls are thin, and you can hear the cough of your neighbor through the plaster. The air smells faintly of boiled cabbage because that is what most people cook. Cheap, filling, and available. You stretch, glance at the clock, and know that today will be like yesterday, and like tomorrow. Life in the Soviet Union was predictable, structured, and in many ways exhausting. People often think of the Soviet Union only in terms of politics, Cold War tensions, and powerful leaders like Stalin or Khrushchev. But real life, the daily existence of millions of ordinary people, was not about meetings in the Kremlin or speeches on Red Square. It was about long lines, crowded housing, factory shifts, school lessons, rationing, and the quiet endurance of families who had little choice but to adapt. And here's where I'd like you to settle in. Breathe slowly. Because tonight we are not racing through history. We are walking carefully, step by step, through the details of ordinary life. The boring details. The cabbage soup, the shared kitchens, the queue for bread that stretched around the corner. The things that textbooks leave out but that shaped the rhythm of Soviet existence. Life in the Soviet Union was, at its heart, a story of survival within limitations. After the devastation of the Second World War, cities were scarred and resources scarce. Housing shortages were extreme. Families were crammed into what were known as communal apartments, kommunalki. Imagine an old pre-revolutionary mansion in St. Petersburg or Moscow. Once upon a time, it belonged to a wealthy merchant or aristocrat. After the revolution, however, the state took over. The rooms were carved up. One family lived in the grand dining hall, another in the library, another in the former nursery. Dozens of people might share one bathroom and one kitchen. Privacy in such a place was nearly impossible. You could not avoid your neighbors' arguments, or their music, or their smells. And yet, people adapted. They hung blankets across doorways to mark off space. They learned to cook quickly when their turn at the stove came. They tried, in small ways, to make these crowded, noisy apartments into something like a home. The morning routine for most workers began early. Factories demanded punctuality, and trains and buses were often overcrowded. Workers carried small bags, sometimes with bread wrapped in newspaper or a flask of tea. Breakfasts were usually simple. Black bread, maybe some butter or jam if you were lucky, or porridge. Meat was rare and precious. Coffee was a luxury. Tea was the drink of the people, strong and sweet. Education was central to Soviet identity. Children wore uniforms, with little red scarves for those in the Young Pioneers, the Soviet Youth Organization. Schools taught reading, writing, mathematics, and history, but they also instilled ideology. The walls of classrooms were decorated with portraits of Lenin, sometimes Stalin, and slogans about loyalty to the party. Children learned poems about factories and tractors, not just about flowers and sunshine. Yet, within these rigid frameworks, there were dedicated teachers, bright students, and small joys. Sports days, songs, and stories. For many families, the central struggle was food. Rationing had been strict during the war, and shortages continued well after. Queues became part of life. If word spread that a store had received a shipment of sausage, people rushed to stand in line, sometimes for hours, not knowing if enough would be left when they reached the counter. Women carried cloth shopping bags everywhere, just in case. It was a habit, to be ready at any moment, because you never knew what might suddenly appear in a store. There was also the matter of work. Jobs were guaranteed in the Soviet Union. Unemployment was officially non-existent, but this did not mean work was always meaningful or efficient. Factories operated according to strict plans, known as 5-year plans, which set ambitious targets for production. Workers sometimes found themselves producing thousands of nails, for example, but not of the right size, because the target was measured in weight, not in usefulness. Still, the system kept people occupied, and for many, work was a point of pride. Engineers, miners, teachers, and nurses all carried the sense that they were contributing to a great collective project. Entertainment, too, had its own Soviet flavor. People gathered in kitchens, even cramped communal ones, to talk, share stories, and sometimes whisper opinions that could not be said loudly. Music came from radios, often government-approved songs, but occasionally Western jazz or rock found its way in, despite being frowned upon. Cinema was a popular escape. Soviet films were often patriotic, but they also included comedies and romances that gave people a break from their daily worries. A night at the cinema, or a trip to the theater or ballet for those in larger cities, was a special occasion. Leisure for the average family might mean a day in the countryside, called dacha life. If you were fortunate enough to have a small dacha, even just a simple wooden hut outside the city, you could grow vegetables, relax by a river, and escape the grayness of urban life. Trains packed with city dwellers heading out to the countryside on weekends became a familiar sight. But of course, life in the Soviet Union was not only about food, housing, and work. It was also about the constant presence of the state. Posters declared slogans about loyalty. Meetings at workplaces reminded everyone of their duty. Newspapers told of successes in space, in industry, in agriculture, but never admitted failures. And behind it all was the quiet knowledge that criticism could be dangerous. People learned to live with two voices: the public one, which repeated what was safe to say, and the private one, which was spoken only among trusted friends. In kitchens, whispers traveled about shortages, about injustices, about the strange contradictions of life. You could work hard, but still not afford shoes. You could be told your country was mighty, but stand in line for bread. And yet, here's something worth reflecting on. Life was not simply misery. There was resilience. There were moments of laughter, warmth, and even pride. Soviet people found ways to celebrate holidays, to fall in love, to raise children, to build friendships. They navigated a system that often felt heavy and rigid, but within it, they carved out spaces of humanity. As you're listening, maybe you're thinking about your own routines, the way you wake up, the meals you eat, the bus rides or commutes you make. Imagine all of that, but placed in the setting of the Soviet Union, where choices were narrower, but community often stronger. And here is a gentle reminder. If you are finding this journey through history calming and interesting, you can share it with others. Like this story, leave a comment about where you're listening from, and let us know what kind of history you'd like to drift off to next. And if you want more quiet stories of the past, subscribing helps you return to these peaceful journeys each night. So, what was life like in the Soviet Union? It was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that people woke, worked, ate, and slept like anywhere else. Extraordinary in the sense that their lives were shaped by one of the most powerful and rigid systems of the 20th century. They lived in a society where the collective was prized over the individual, where scarcity bred patience, and where small pleasures carried deep meaning. And yet, we must pause here, because we have only begun to explore. We've walked through the door of a communal apartment, stood in line for bread, and peeked into a classroom. But so much more remains to be uncovered. How did families truly adapt to the shortages? What role did propaganda play in shaping not only politics, but even the most private corners of people's minds? And how did ordinary citizens navigate the balance between loyalty and quiet resistance? Those questions linger, and perhaps they are where we should go next. Story 2. Weird Sleep Habits of Medieval People. Section. Picture yourself in a medieval village, sometime around the 13th century. The sun has long set, and the streets are quiet. No glowing lamps, no steady hum of electricity. Only the faint shimmer of torches, the distant crackle of a hearth, and the black sky overhead. For us today, the night is merely a pause, softened by lights and screens. But for them, the night was deep, consuming, and mysterious. Sleep was not just a natural rhythm. It was an entire culture shaped by fear, faith, and survival. The first thing to understand is that medieval people did not sleep like we do. The 8-hour, uninterrupted block of rest we now think of as normal is a modern invention. In the Middle Ages, most people followed what was called a segmented sleep pattern. They went to bed shortly after sunset, slept for several hours, then awoke in the middle of the night, sometimes for an hour, sometimes 2, before returning to sleep until dawn. Imagine that moment in the middle of the night. You stir awake, perhaps around midnight. The fire in the hearth is glowing low, casting long shadows across the room. You sit up, maybe say a short prayer, check on the livestock, or even visit a neighbor. In some places, people referred to this as their first sleep and second sleep. Between the two, they often found a strange kind of peace, a time for quiet reflection, storytelling, or even intimacy. For them, waking at midnight was not unusual, but simply part of life's rhythm. Where did they sleep? That depended greatly on who you were. For peasants, homes were small, sometimes just 1 or 2 rooms. Families often slept together in the same space. Parents, children, and sometimes even servants or visiting relatives crowded onto straw mattresses, with blankets made of wool or furs. Privacy was rare, but warmth was essential. The body heat of others combined with the weight of blankets kept out the cold. In some cases, livestock, sheep, goats, or even a cow, were brought indoors during winter nights. Their warmth, too, helped families survive the bitter cold. Beds themselves were simple. A wooden frame filled with straw or hay, topped with a coarse sheet or blanket. Wealthier households used feather mattresses, but even then, comfort was not what we think of today. Pillows were few and often stuffed with straw. Linen sheets were valuable, carefully washed and stored. For nobles and the wealthy, beds became symbols of status. A grand 4-poster bed, draped with heavy curtains, stood as much for display as for rest. Curtains kept out drafts, but they also offered a rare sense of privacy. In a medieval castle, servants came and went constantly. Having a bed you could close off was a luxury. Some beds were carved with ornate designs, passed down through generations like treasures. And yet, the night was never fully safe. In villages and towns, darkness brought dangers. Thieves, wild animals, fires that could spread quickly from a single spark. People often went to bed early, partly because candles and lamp oil were expensive, but also because wandering at night carried risks. The night watch, sometimes little more than a few men with torches, patrolled the streets, calling out the hours. Their voices reminded those awake, or those between first and second sleep, that danger was always close. Inside the home, sleep was shaped by superstition. Dreams were not dismissed as random images. They were taken seriously, often seen as messages. A dream of water might mean fortune. A dream of fire could mean trouble. Religious leaders preached about the dangers of sinful dreams, warning that even one's sleep could be touched by temptation. Some people hung charms near the bed to ward off evil spirits. Others muttered prayers before closing their eyes, asking for protection through the dark hours. One curious detail about medieval sleep was the way time itself was measured. Without clocks as we know them, people relied on natural rhythms. The crowing of roosters, the tolling of church bells, or the shifting of stars in the sky marked the hours. Monks, in particular, lived by a strict schedule of prayers, waking in the middle of the night to chant and sing in cold stone chapels. For them, sleep was secondary to devotion. Rising at midnight for the matins prayer was a sacred duty. Ordinary villagers, hearing the distant bells, sometimes stirred in their own homes, reminded of the rhythm of prayer that underpinned medieval life. The communal nature of sleep is another thing that feels strange to us. Today, we prize personal space. In the Middle Ages, sleep was rarely private. Servants often slept in the same room as their masters, though on the floor or on simple pallets. Travelers sometimes shared beds in inns, not out of intimacy but practicality. A mattress was expensive and space limited. Two strangers might lie down back to back, grateful simply to have a place to rest. Even within families, shared beds were the norm. Parents slept beside children, grandparents beside grandchildren. In some cases, bed sharing was seen as a way to build bonds, to pass on warmth and stories. The idea of a child sleeping alone in a separate room would have seemed wasteful, even dangerous. Another curious practice was the use of nightcaps. Not just a figure of speech, but real cloth caps worn to bed. With drafty houses and cold winters, keeping one's head warm was essential. People also wrapped themselves in layers of cloth, sometimes even sleeping in their day clothes. Washing was infrequent, so garments often doubled as pajamas. And then there was the light. A flickering candle, or a fire reduced to glowing embers, was often the only source of illumination. Shadows danced across the walls, shapes shifting in the corners of the room. It is no wonder that the night carried mystery, and sometimes fear. Folk tales of ghosts, demons, and witches often grew out of the strange sights and sounds of the dark. The creak of a settling roof, the howl of a wolf, the wind against a shutter. All could stir unease in those lying awake. You might be wondering, did people in the Middle Ages sleep well? The answer is complicated. Sleep was shorter in summer, longer in winter. It was broken, segmented, and sometimes restless. Yet it matched their world. Without electric lights or alarm clocks, their rhythms followed the sun and the seasons. Some historians suggest that waking in the middle of the night gave people a chance to think, to pray, to talk quietly with a spouse, or simply to stare into the darkness and reflect. And maybe that's something worth reflecting on ourselves. Today, we often treat waking at night as a problem, a sign of insomnia. But for centuries, it was simply normal. Perhaps in the silence of midnight, the medieval sleeper found a kind of peace that we have forgotten. Now, before we drift too far into thought, let me remind you gently. If you find these details soothing, if they help you wander into history while your eyes grow heavy, you can share them. Leave a soft comment about what surprised you most. Maybe the idea of first and second sleep, or the thought of families sleeping side by side with livestock. And if you'd like to return for more quiet stories, subscribing keeps this door open, so you'll always have another calm journey to step into. But our exploration is far from finished. We've looked at beds, patterns, and the strange rhythm of medieval nights. Yet many questions remain. What did this broken sleep mean for health, for dreams, for the way people understood the boundary between night and day? How did monasteries, castles, and villages differ in their nightly routines? And what secrets of medieval sleep are still waiting to be uncovered? For now, we'll leave those questions open, like a door half closed against the cold. Section 2. In the hush of the medieval night, when fires burned low and the world slipped into shadow, sleep was never merely rest. It was a threshold, a borderland between the earthly and the spiritual. To close one's eyes was to step into a space filled with meanings, warnings, and mysteries. For peasants, sleep was practical. It was the recovery of tired muscles after long days in the fields. But even then, dreams were treated with caution. If a farmer dreamt of a cow giving birth, he might take it as a sign of fortune. If he dreamt of storms, he might worry that his crops were doomed. These weren't idle superstitions. They were woven into the very fabric of survival. The Church, which guided nearly every part of medieval life, taught that dreams could be holy or dangerous. Saints' lives were full of visions received during sleep. A monk might dream of the Virgin Mary or of Christ himself, and the dream could be written down as a sign from heaven. But ordinary people were warned to be careful. Not every dream came from God. Some, priests said, were planted by demons, slipping temptations into the mind while the body lay helpless. To dream of lust, greed, or violence was considered a sin of the soul, a reminder that even sleep was not safe from corruption. Fear of the night ran deep. The dark was full of terrors that modern minds, accustomed to electric lights and locked doors, struggled to imagine. There were folk tales of spirits who pressed upon a sleeper's chest, making it hard to breathe. We know this today as sleep paralysis, but for them it was the work of a night hag, an evil presence that crept into the room unseen. Others spoke of fairies who stole sleeping children, or witches who drained life from those lying in bed. Such fears made people cautious. Charms were placed at the bedside, crosses hung above doors, and prayers whispered before the fire was covered for the night. In noble households, the dangers were no less real, though they took different forms. A great lord might sleep in a curtained bed, but those curtains could conceal intruders. In an age of constant feuds, assassination was not uncommon. Knights and noblemen sometimes kept weapons near at hand while they slept. Guards patrolled castle corridors, yet still, the night carried unease. For a nobleman, to be caught asleep could mean vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous. Monks, on the other hand, experienced sleep through the strict lens of discipline. In monasteries, the schedule of prayers dictated every hour. The bell might ring at midnight, calling the brothers from their straw-filled pallets. They would rise in silence, wash their faces in cold water, and shuffle into the chapel for matins. After chanting by candlelight, they might return to rest for a while before the next bell summoned them again. Sleep was fragmented, but this too was seen as holy. To deny oneself comfort was a form of devotion. Even the very spaces of sleep carried meaning. In peasant huts, the bed was close to the hearth. The glowing embers kept away frost, but also reminded the family of life's fragility. If the fire went out in winter, it could mean sickness or death. In towns, beds were closer together, as neighbors often shared cramped lodgings. In castles, the bedchamber was not always private. Servants might sleep nearby, ready to assist if called. The sense of personal space we cherish today was almost unknown. And yet, across all these layers of society, one idea remained common. Sleep connected the human world with forces beyond. Dreams, especially vivid ones, were recorded and passed on. In royal courts, dream interpreters sometimes advised kings. A monarch who dreamt of a falling star might see it as a warning of rebellion. A queen who dreamt of a blooming rose might interpret it as a sign of fertility or peace. Though the interpretations varied, the belief that dreams carried messages was widespread. One particularly strange medieval habit was the practice of night watching. Sometimes people would deliberately stay awake during the night, either for religious reasons or in times of anxiety. On the eve of battles, soldiers often kept vigil, praying and sharpening weapons, watching the flicker of firelight as they prepared for the dawn. Villagers, too, sometimes kept watch over the sick or the dead, sitting through long hours to guard against spirits or to honor those who had passed. In these vigils, sleep was not only postponed but transformed into something sacred. The rhythm of first sleep and second sleep also shaped how nights were experienced. Between the two rests, people often got up to do quiet tasks, spinning wool, mending clothes, even making short visits to neighbors. In some cases, this was when intimacy between married couples took place, seen as a time blessed with fertility. Others used the midnight pause for prayer, believing that the hours of deepest silence were closest to God. The night, in this sense, was not an unbroken absence, but a shifting space filled with activity, meaning, and ritual. There were also curious practices connected to health. Some medieval physicians believed that sleep postures affected well-being. Sleeping on the left side was discouraged, said to burden the heart, while lying flat on the back was thought to invite nightmares. Physicians advised against eating heavy meals before bed, warning that undigested food could cause bad dreams. They recommended herbs such as valerian or chamomile to calm the mind, though such remedies were mostly available to the wealthy. For the poor, exhaustion itself was the cure. In some towns, public regulations even touched sleep. Curfews were announced with the ringing of bells, signaling that people should extinguish their fires and go indoors. To disobey was to risk fines, or worse, the suspicion of being a thief. The night was communal property, dangerous if not respected. When the curfew bell rang, the world seemed to fold in on itself, each household retreating into its fragile circle of warmth and slumber. What fascinates us most, perhaps, is the way medieval people embraced the strangeness of the night. They lived with rhythms we would now call irregular. They accepted broken sleep as natural. They treated dreams as significant, not mere fragments of the mind. They shared beds, shared rooms, even shared fears, binding their nights together just as their days were bound by labor and prayer. If you close your eyes and imagine it, you might picture yourself lying on a straw mattress in a dim cottage. You hear the creak of wood as the wind blows outside. Beside you, a sibling shifts in their sleep. Beyond the door, a cow stirs in the cold. You drift into first sleep, wake at midnight, murmur a prayer, then sink again into second sleep. In that rhythm, strange though it feels to us, there was a kind of harmony with the world, a way of living that matched the sun, the seasons, and the ever-present mysteries of night. And if you're still listening, drifting along with this tale, let me gently remind you, if you found something new here, or if this calm journey through the past has eased your evening, you can share it with others. Write a comment about which medieval habit you find the most unusual. Would it be sleeping in 2 segments, or wearing a nightcap, or sharing a bed with strangers? And if you'd like to hear more, subscribing keeps these stories flowing, so there will always be another one waiting when you need it. But we are not yet finished. There are stranger things still to uncover. In the final part of this story, we will explore the superstitions and rituals that surrounded sleep, how people protected themselves from the terrors of night, what remedies they trusted, and what legends grew from the shadows of the bedchamber. For now, let the thought linger like a flicker of candlelight. In the medieval world, the night was never empty. It was alive with meaning, both comforting and unsettling, waiting to be remembered. Section 2. If you lean in closer, beyond the crowded kitchens and endless queues, you begin to see another layer of Soviet life. Not just the daily grind of food, work, and housing, but the atmosphere. The invisible world of symbols, posters, speeches, and expectations that shaped how people thought about themselves. In the Soviet Union, propaganda was not something you encountered occasionally, like a billboard or a political speech. It was everywhere. On walls, in schools, in workplaces, on the radio, in newspapers, even painted on the sides of buildings. It was constant, like the background noise of a city that you eventually stop noticing. And yet it seeped into every corner of life. Posters showed smiling workers, heroic farmers, children saluting with bright eyes. Slogans urged people to work harder, to believe in progress, to trust the party. Glory to the builders of communism. "Forward, comrades. The future belongs to us." These phrases echoed so often that they became almost like wallpaper, familiar, unquestioned, yet quietly influential. And here is where life grew complicated. On one hand, propaganda was uplifting. It gave people a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than themselves. For a coal miner in Donbass or a teacher in Novosibirsk, the idea that their labor was building a radiant future gave meaning to endless hours of toil. On the other hand, the gap between slogans and reality was obvious. Posters showed overflowing wheat fields, but stores had empty shelves. Speeches promised abundance, but families counted ration coupons. This tension between the dream and the reality was something every Soviet citizen learned to navigate. Children, in particular, were raised in this atmosphere. From their earliest school years, they were told stories of heroes. Not fairy tales of dragons and princesses, but real Soviet heroes. Pilots, workers, young pioneers who had sacrificed for the state. Books and lessons taught them to admire bravery, loyalty, and selflessness. Every child was expected to join the young pioneers, wearing the red scarf with pride. Ceremonies marked the moment of joining, and it was seen as an honor. But behind the rituals, parents sometimes whispered different stories. At kitchen tables with the curtains drawn, adults spoke carefully. They remembered times of hunger, times of arrests, times when neighbors vanished in the night. They did not share these memories with children too soon, because to speak openly could be dangerous. A careless word, even from a child repeating something overheard, might cause trouble. This duality, one story for the public, another for the private, was perhaps the most defining feature of Soviet existence. Family life reflected this balance between public and private. Inside the cramped walls of an apartment, parents tried to create warmth. They celebrated birthdays with simple cakes, sometimes just a sponge flavored with a bit of jam. They marked holidays with gatherings, even when resources were scarce. New Year's was especially important, more than Christmas, because religious holidays were discouraged by the state. On New Year's Eve, families decorated trees, exchanged gifts, and shared what food they could manage. Children went to bed excited, waking to find small toys, sweets, or fruit. Oranges especially were treasured, because they were rare and exotic. Food itself carried deep meaning. A pot of borscht simmering on the stove, the smell of dill and garlic, the warmth of bread just out of the oven. These were not luxuries, but they gave comfort. In many families, meals were shared with extended relatives or neighbors. There was always a sense of making do with little, of stretching ingredients as far as possible, yet there was also pride in hospitality. Even when cupboards were nearly bare, hosts tried to offer something to a guest, even if it was just tea and a slice of bread. Outside the home, life revolved around work and the workplace. Factories, collective farms, schools, and offices were not just places of labor. They were communities. Workers knew one another, shared gossip, helped each other through shortages. In many cases, workplaces also organized cultural events, theater performances, sports teams, choirs. The state encouraged these activities, both as a way of building unity and of filling people's time with useful pursuits. Leisure was structured, guided, and always under the eye of official organizations. Yet within this structure, people carved out their own joys. A worker might find pride in making a machine run smoothly. A teacher might take delight in a bright student's curiosity. A farmer might quietly save the best vegetables for family, while officially delivering the required quotas. The Soviet calendar itself was unusual. Religious holidays were downplayed, but political anniversaries were celebrated with grandeur. May Day, for example, was marked with parades, banners, and speeches about workers' achievements. On the anniversary of the October Revolution, fireworks lit the skies of Moscow and Leningrad. Children waved flags, workers marched in lines, and portraits of Lenin hung from buildings. These were moments of collective performance. times when the individual disappeared into the mass and the mass became a symbol of unity. But behind the spectacle, ordinary people sometimes felt ambivalent. The parades were long, the speeches repetitive, and attendance often mandatory. Some went with genuine enthusiasm, others went because it was safer not to stand out. And afterward, life returned to the grayness of queues, shortages, and routine. Culture, however, remained a powerful escape. Literature thrived, even under censorship. Writers had to navigate a careful path, praising the state while subtly hinting at deeper truths. Some, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, eventually broke through the boundaries, exposing the darker sides of Soviet life, but at great personal cost. For ordinary readers, books were treasures. Libraries were crowded, and people passed novels from hand to hand. To own a banned or foreign book was risky, but for some, it was worth it. Music, too, carried layers. Official songs praised the homeland, the party, and progress. But in private, people listened to tapes of Western music, copied secretly, shared quietly. These were called magnetizdat. Homemade recordings passed along like whispers. Jazz, rock, and even the Beatles found their way into Soviet apartments, sparking joy among young people eager to feel connected to the wider world. Cinema remained perhaps the most accessible art. Soviet studios produced films that combined propaganda with entertainment. Historical epics celebrated Russian heroes. Comedies poked fun at everyday frustrations, offering a safe outlet for laughter. Families went together, sitting in dark theaters watching stories unfold that were both familiar and larger than life. One of the more fascinating aspects of Soviet life was the way people developed strategies to survive shortages. Barter was common, trading sugar for soap or meat for fabric. Connections, known as blate, mattered greatly. If you knew someone in a store, a warehouse, or a transport office, you might get access to goods others could not. These networks of favors and obligations formed a hidden economy, one that existed alongside the official system. And then there were the small acts of defiance. A joke told quietly, mocking the party. A photograph of a Western movie star pinned secretly on a wall. A letter hidden in a drawer. These gestures may have seemed trivial, but they represented something larger. The persistence of individuality in a system that prized conformity. And through it all, the Soviet Union projected itself outward as a global power. Citizens watched proudly as Sputnik was launched into space, as Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit the Earth. These achievements gave genuine pride, proof that, despite the shortages and difficulties, their nation stood at the forefront of human progress. When Gagarin smiled from posters across the country, it was not just propaganda. It was a symbol of hope. Yet the paradox remained. At home, families still waited in line for bread. Mothers worried about shoes for children. Fathers patched old coats because new ones were expensive and hard to find. The contrast between cosmic triumphs and earthly struggles defined much of Soviet life. As you listen to this slow journey through the details, you might find yourself drifting into thought. How do people adapt when their lives are shaped by both pride and scarcity, by community and surveillance, by warmth and fear? These questions are not only about the past, they echo into the present. And here, let me remind you gently, if you're still with me in this story, you can share it with others. Leave a quiet comment about what part of this history feels most surprising to you. Perhaps you can even tell us where you're listening from. A small mark of connection across time and place. And of course, subscribing brings you back each night to more of these calm wanderings through forgotten worlds. The story of Soviet life is not finished yet. We've seen the kitchens, the schools, the posters, the queues. We've heard the whispers behind closed doors. But there is still more. How did ordinary citizens deal with the state's reach into their personal lives? How did surveillance, fear, and the possibility of punishment shape daily choices? And in the middle of it all, How did people still find joy, love, and meaning? Those are questions waiting for us, just around the corner. Section 3. When we step into the final layer of Soviet life, the air grows heavier. Beneath the smells of cabbage soup and coal smoke, beneath the posters of smiling workers and bright futures, there was something else. The quiet presence of the state, watching. The Soviet Union was not only a society of shortages and routines, it was also a society of surveillance. The secret police, known as the KGB in later years, represented the long arm of authority. Most people never had direct contact with them, but everyone felt their shadow. It was not always about arrests or interrogations. Often it was about the possibility, the uncertainty, the awareness that a wrong word spoken too loudly, a joke told to the wrong person, could bring trouble. Neighbors sometimes informed on one another, not always out of malice, but sometimes to protect themselves, or even because they truly believed in the system. A casual remark in a workplace meeting might end up in a report. A suspicious friendship, a letter from abroad, a habit of reading too much. All of these could raise eyebrows. And so, people learned to be careful, to separate their inner thoughts from their outer words. This split life, public and private, cautious and honest, shaped generations. Children grew up sensing it, even when adults did not explain. They learned which topics were safe for school and which were only whispered at home. They understood, without being told, that some questions should not be asked too loudly. Fear, however, was only one part of the picture. Equally important was resilience. In fact, resilience became almost a quiet art form. People found ways to carry on, to adapt, to keep going. They joked about the system, often in whispers, telling small anecdotes that poked fun at bureaucracy or shortages. These jokes, called anecdoti, spread from person to person, creating a shared sense of survival through humor. One might go like this. Why do Soviet stores look like museums? Because you can look, but you can't buy. Simple, but sharp. It captured the daily reality of empty shelves better than any speech or complaint. Humor gave release. It reminded people they were not alone in their frustrations. And in some strange way, the very act of laughing in private, even when the public demanded seriousness, became an act of quiet resistance. Religion, too, survived in the shadows. Officially, the Soviet Union was atheist. Churches were closed or repurposed, priests were monitored. Yet many families continued traditions quietly. They baptized children, lit candles, whispered prayers. In rural areas especially, faith persisted, passed down not in public sermons but in family kitchens and secret gatherings. To believe was not just spiritual, it was cultural, a link to ancestors and identity. And then there were the intellectuals, the dissidents, writers, poets, scientists, and artists who dared to push boundaries. Some were silenced, imprisoned, or forced into exile. Others found subtle ways to express truth within the limits of censorship. Their courage was not only in their words, but in their persistence. For ordinary people, simply hearing that such voices existed gave hope, a reminder that not everyone bowed completely to the system. Despite the weight of surveillance and censorship, life had its joys. Weddings were celebrated with music, dancing, and long tables of food, however modest. Families gathered for picnics in the countryside, carrying baskets of bread, boiled eggs, cucumbers, and perhaps a bottle of homemade vodka. Children played games in courtyards, building friendships that lasted decades. Love stories unfolded in workplaces, in universities, in parks, proving that even in a controlled society, the human heart found its own path. Sport became another outlet. Soviet athletes trained hard, often under strict programs, but their victories on the world stage filled citizens with pride. To see a gymnast win gold at the Olympics, or a hockey team defeat rivals, was more than just sport. It was proof, at least for a moment, that the sacrifices of daily life had meaning. that their country stood tall. Yet, as decades passed, cracks deepened. By the 1970s and 1980s, shortages grew worse, cynicism spread, and the grand promises of communism felt increasingly hollow. People still stood in lines, still worked in factories, still read slogans, but the gap between words and reality widened. Children who had grown up under portraits of Lenin now whispered about jeans, Western music, and freedom. Parents still taught resilience, but they also quietly admitted doubts. It is important to pause here, though, because even in decline, the Soviet Union remained a world unto itself. For those who lived through it, it was not simply grayness or oppression. It was home. It was the streets they walked, the schools they attended, the friendships they cherished. Nostalgia for Soviet times is real for many, even today. Not because people long for shortages or censorship, but because they remember the sense of community, the certainty of employment, the pride of belonging to something larger, and this is where the story turns reflective. What can we learn, drifting slowly through these memories of Soviet life? Perhaps it is this: human beings are remarkably adaptable. They can live in communal apartments with thin walls and still carve out warmth. They can endure shortages and still celebrate with laughter. They can live under surveillance and still find ways to whisper truth. The Soviet Union, in all its contradictions, was a vast experiment in human endurance, sometimes harsh, sometimes inspiring, always complex. As you close your eyes, think of the millions of ordinary lives that unfolded under that red flag. The mother boiling soup in a shared kitchen, the child reciting a poem at school, the miner wiping sweat from his brow, the grandmother saving a treasured orange for her grandchild on New Year's Eve. None of them appear in history books, yet they are the real story. The story of daily life, boring in its details but profound in its meaning. And perhaps you're wondering now, how does this past connect to our present? The Soviet Union has vanished from maps, but the questions it raises remain alive. How much freedom does a person need to feel truly human? How much security are they willing to trade for stability? What happens when promises of progress clash with the realities of daily life? These are not questions with simple answers. They linger quietly, like the echoes of footsteps in a communal hallway. And maybe that is the true legacy of the Soviet Union. Not just its politics or its leaders, but the questions it leaves us with, questions about resilience, conformity, resistance, and the unshakable endurance of ordinary people. If you've stayed with me through this quiet journey, I'd like to thank you. These stories are not glamorous or fast-paced. They are the slow heartbeat of history, steady and patient. If you found them calming, you can share them with others. Leave a gentle comment about what surprised you most. Tell us where you are listening from. And if you'd like more quiet wanderings through the past, subscribing keeps this door open night after night. And so we close this first story, but not with a final period, because history never ends neatly. It lingers. The Soviet Union has gone, yet the memories remain. The question is, how will we remember them? Section 3. The medieval night was never simply dark, it was thick with mystery. To sleep in those centuries was to surrender, not only to the needs of the body, but also to forces that were unseen, unpredictable, and deeply feared. People took their rest, but always with a sense that something, or someone, might be near. Superstition clung to every shadow. The bed, humble as it might be, was seen as both a refuge and a vulnerable place. To lie down was to become still, silent, and defenseless. And so people surrounded sleep with rituals designed to protect them from harm. One common practice was prayer before bed. A child might kneel by a straw pallet, reciting verses taught by parents, asking for protection through the night. A peasant woman might cross herself before pulling the blanket up to her chin. A monk, already shaped by strict discipline, would chant short psalms in the dim glow of a candle. These prayers were not only habits of faith, they were shields, spiritual guards against the dangers of night. But prayers alone did not feel sufficient. Across villages and towns, charms and tokens became part of the bedtime routine. Some households placed iron near the bed, a nail, a knife, even a simple horseshoe. Iron was thought to repel evil spirits, its weight and hardness a kind of invisible barrier. Others tied sprigs of protective herbs, like St. John's wort or rosemary, above the doorway or tucked them into pillows. Salt was another common defense. It might be scattered around the threshold of the home, or kept in a small dish near the bedside. To many medieval people, salt was pure, cleansing, a material that disrupted the power of dark forces. A child, restless and fearful, might be soothed by a parent sprinkling salt near the cradle, whispering that it would keep away witches or fairies. Dreams, too, demanded their own set of protections. If one feared nightmares, a small prayer book might be laid beneath the pillow. Some even wrote verses of scripture on slips of parchment and tucked them inside cloth amulets. Others relied on folk charms, a carved figure, a bead, or a symbol of the cross. Each object carried a story, a hope that the restless mind could be guarded while the body slept. Animals, always close to medieval life, played their part as well. Cats, though sometimes feared for their supposed connection to witchcraft, were also kept near beds to chase away vermin. Dogs, loyal companions, often shared the sleeping space, their presence bringing warmth and security. In some regions, people believed that roosters crowing in the early morning drove away lingering spirits of the night. To hear that crow was to feel that the world was once again safe. The night's dangers dissolved with the light of dawn. For mothers, protecting children's sleep was a matter of deep concern. Infants, so small and fragile, were believed to be targets of fairies or wandering spirits. Cradles were often lined with protective charms, carved crosses, bits of red thread, or even fragments of bread. Rocking a cradle was more than soothing. It was a ritual, a way of keeping rhythm against unseen dangers. Some mothers whispered lullabies not only to calm but also to shield, their songs carrying prayers hidden within the melody. The physical rituals of sleep were just as telling. Beds were often arranged with purpose. A peasant family might position the bed so that the sleeper's head faced east, toward the rising sun, a gesture of hope and renewal. To sleep with one's feet toward the door was avoided in some places, thought to resemble the way bodies were laid out for burial. Even the act of covering the fire at night carried symbolic weight. Ashes spread over the glowing embers were called the curfew, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. This practice was both safety and ritual, sealing the day and protecting the family from wandering spirits that might slip in through smoke or flame. In noble homes, rituals were layered with luxury. A lady of a castle might be attended by servants who pulled heavy curtains around her bed, shutting out drafts but also symbolically sealing her away from danger. The curtains were often embroidered with religious symbols, saints or biblical scenes, reminders that even in sleep one was never far from the sacred. Perfumed herbs were scattered on linen sheets, both for comfort and for health, since foul smells were thought to cause illness and disturbed dreams. Monasteries, too, had their sleep rituals, though they were stark. Before lying down, monks recited prayers for protection against sin and temptation. They slept in simple robes, belts removed, lying on straw or wooden boards. Silence was strict, and even dreams were subject to scrutiny. If a monk admitted to troubling visions, it was discussed with his superior as a matter of spiritual health. To sleep without sin was considered as important as to wake without fault. Superstitions about sleep often spilled into medicine. Medieval physicians, guided by humoral theory, linked rest to the balance of bodily fluids. Too much sleep was said to make one sluggish, dominated by phlegm. Too little, and the body became overheated with choler. Prescriptions were offered for better rest, drinking warm milk, using lavender, or in some cases, bleeding or purging the body to restore balance. Astrology, too, played a role. Some believed that the stars and planets influenced the quality of one's sleep. A person born under a particular zodiac sign might be more prone to nightmares, while others were thought to sleep more deeply during certain phases of the moon. Physicians sometimes timed treatments or prayers according to these celestial rhythms, weaving the night sky into the bedroom. What is most striking is how ordinary these rituals were. For the medieval person, there was no sharp divide between religion, superstition, medicine, and daily life. To sprinkle salt at the door, to say a prayer, to arrange the bed in a certain way, these were not separate acts but part of a seamless fabric of belief. Sleep was both vulnerable and sacred, both ordinary and mystical. Imagine, if you will, lying in a small chamber in a medieval village. The wind rattles the shutters and the fire glows faintly under its cover of ash. A wooden cross hangs near the bed. A sprig of rosemary rests on the windowsill. A mother hums a soft tune, rocking a cradle beside you. Somewhere, far away, a monastery bell tolls in the night. You close your eyes, trusting that the charms, prayers, and rituals you've performed will keep you safe until the rooster calls the morning. And now, let me gently remind you, before you drift too far, if these calm stories from the past help you find rest, you can let others know. Share a quiet comment about which medieval sleep ritual surprised you most. Was it the iron nail by the bed, the salt scattered on the floor, or the practice of facing east to greet the dawn? By sharing, you help these forgotten habits live again, softly carried into modern memory. The medieval night has faded now, its rituals set aside, its superstitions dimmed by centuries of change. And yet, if you think about it, do we not still have our own bedtime rituals? A glass of warm milk, a locked door, a lamp left burning in the hall. Perhaps we are not so far from the medieval sleeper after all. We still seek safety, comfort, and meaning in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. And as you rest, consider this question. What will people centuries from now think of our sleep rituals? Will they seem strange, unnecessary, even superstitious? Or will they recognize, across the gulf of time, the same human need to make peace with the night? Story 3. Food Rationing and Everyday Survival in World War II. Section 1. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 brought with it many sudden changes. Armies marched, governments issued decrees, and borders shifted. But for ordinary people, the war first arrived not on the battlefield, but on the dinner table. Food, once simple and taken for granted, became the most carefully measured aspect of daily life. When rationing was first announced in Britain in January 1940, it felt both startling and oddly reassuring. The Ministry of Food promised that rationing would ensure fairness, that no matter how rich or poor you were, everyone would have access to the same essential supplies. But behind this promise lay a harsh reality. The seas were dangerous. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships that carried food from overseas. Without those imports, Britain could not feed its people in the way it once had. The ration books were small, ordinary-looking, but their impact was enormous. Each family received a book filled with coupons, little squares of printed paper that represented meat, sugar, fats, and other essentials. To buy butter, one needed a coupon. To buy meat, another coupon. Shops would carefully cut or stamp these squares, recording purchases with neat handwriting and ledgers. There was no sneaking extra unless one was willing to risk trouble with the authorities. The weekly rations sound meager to modern ears. At the height of rationing, a typical adult was allowed just 4 ounces of bacon or ham, 2 ounces of butter, and a small portion of meat. Sugar was limited to 8 ounces per week. Tea, that daily comfort, was restricted to 2 ounces, about enough for a few cups each day. And yet, people learned to live within these limits. Recipes shifted, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with surprising creativity. Instead of butter, families used margarine. Instead of white bread, There was the national loaf, a dense grayish bread made from wholemeal flour, often unpopular but undeniably filling. Cakes became rarities, baked only for special occasions, and sweetened with carrots or dried fruit when sugar was scarce. Housewives learned to stretch meals, making soups from bones, stews from small scraps of meat, and puddings from anything that could be boiled and thickened. The Ministry of Food even published recipe leaflets, encouraging families to experiment with dishes like mock goose, made from potatoes and onions, or Woolton pie, a vegetable casserole named after the Minister of Food himself. These recipes were not glamorous, but they kept people fed. The government urged citizens to see it as a patriotic duty. Dig for Victory posters encouraged home gardening, while cheerful radio programs gave cooking advice for stretching every ration to its fullest. Shopping itself became a ritual. Queues stretched down streets as people waited their turn at butchers, grocers, and dairies. A child might be sent with the family ration book, carefully instructed not to lose it. Inside the shop, customers were patient, knowing the choices were limited. Sometimes there was disappointment when supplies ran out early. At other times there was relief in finding a small luxury. Perhaps an egg, perhaps a little extra sugar. Children often remembered rationing as a time of longing. Sweets were strictly controlled, and many had never tasted chocolate until American soldiers arrived later in the war, handing out bars of Hershey's. For some, the memory of that first bite, the sudden, rich sweetness, was unforgettable. But in the early years, even fruit was rare. Bananas disappeared from British shops, and oranges became treasures given only to children or the sick. The emotional weight of rationing was heavy, but it was also strangely unifying. For the first time, rich and poor alike queued for the same portions. Luxury dining all but disappeared. Even the royal family followed rationing rules, setting an example for the nation. Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, was famously photographed with her ration book. It was a gesture that said, "No one is above the struggle." Still, not everyone accepted rationing quietly. There was a black market, small but persistent. If one knew the right people, extra butter or meat could be bought, though at a steep price. Police occasionally raided shops suspected of selling goods off the books. The government treated black marketeering as unpatriotic, even dangerous, since it threatened the fairness of the system. Yet for families with sick children or heavy laborers at home, the temptation was sometimes too strong to resist. Beyond the shops and kitchens, rationing reshaped social life. Meals became simpler, gatherings smaller. A wedding cake might be made from dried fruit, with the sugar ration of half a dozen friends combined to make it possible. Restaurants were tightly regulated, forbidden from serving meals too extravagant, though dining out became a way for some to enjoy a break from ration limits. Workplaces often provided canteens, serving basic but filling lunches for employees who could not always cook at home. Even alcohol felt the pinch. Beer was weaker, wines and spirits rarer. Yet pubs remained popular, their dim rooms offering laughter and companionship in spite of shortages. If anything, rationing encouraged people to savor small pleasures more deeply. A slice of cake at Christmas, a pot of jam made from foraged berries, or a Sunday roast, even if small, became events of joy. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine it. The gray streets under blackout curtains, the rattle of ration books in coat pockets, the patient lines outside shops. A mother stirs a thin soup, stretching it to feed her children. A father carefully slices bacon into 4 small portions. A child chews a carrot, dreaming of chocolate. These were the quiet battles fought in kitchens and pantries, battles of endurance and patience, every day of the war. And yet this was only the beginning. Rationing was not a short-lived policy. It would stretch on for years, shaping an entire generation's relationship with food. People adapted, they coped, and they endured. But the question remains, what happened when shortages grew even sharper, when bombing raids disrupted supplies, and when desperation forced new kinds of creativity. That is where our story turns next. Section 2. By the middle years of the Second World War, rationing was no longer a new experiment. It had become the shape of daily life. Families woke, worked, queued, and cooked within the measured limits of their coupons. What had once felt like a sudden disruption had now become habit, though habit did not make it easy. As the war dragged on, shortages deepened. The seas were still dangerous, convoys still threatened by German U-boats. Imports of wheat, sugar, and meat remained uncertain. At the same time, demand at home was relentless. Soldiers at the front had to be fed, workers in factories needed strength, children required nourishment. And so, rationing became not only stricter, but more creative. The Dig for Victory campaign, first launched at the war's beginning, now became central to survival. Gardens across Britain transformed into miniature farms. Lawns were dug up, flower beds replaced with neat rows of carrots, cabbages, and potatoes. Schoolyards became vegetable plots. Even public parks and palace grounds were cultivated. Photographs of the time show the manicured lawns of Kensington Palace turned into potato fields, and the Tower of London's ancient moat planted with cabbages. Families took pride in their gardens. The Ministry of Agriculture produced leaflets teaching people how to grow food efficiently, how to rotate crops, and how to compost. Radio broadcasts shared tips, while posters declared that every carrot pulled from the soil was a blow against the enemy. For children, gardening became part of schooling. Hands in the soil, learning not only arithmetic and history, but how to raise food in times of need. Yet, even as the nation dug for victory, meals remained simple, often repetitive. Potatoes were called upon again and again. Mashed, roasted, boiled, even turned into flour. Carrots were promoted as a sweet substitute for sugar. Government leaflets offered carrot fudge recipes or encouraged parents to tell children that eating carrots would help them see in the dark. It was a clever piece of propaganda, linking the humble vegetable to improved night vision, when in reality the campaign was meant to hide the secret of radar technology. Bomb shelters, too, became part of mealtimes. Families sometimes carried small parcels of food underground during air raids. In the crowded space of a London Underground station, people unwrapped sandwiches of National Loaf, shared flasks of weak tea, or nibbled on biscuits. It was not comfort dining. It was survival dining, a way to keep fear at bay as bombs thundered above. Children, who often bore the weight of rationing most keenly, were cared for in special ways. School dinners were introduced more widely, ensuring that every child received at least one substantial meal each day. Milk was distributed, sometimes free, sometimes at low cost, with the Ministry of Food emphasizing its importance for growing bodies. Cod liver oil, with its sharp taste, was pressed on children for its nutrients. They swallowed it reluctantly, wrinkling their noses, but parents and teachers insisted it was essential. In rural areas, evacuee children, sent away from bombed cities to live with host families, sometimes encountered a different kind of food shortage. Country families might have gardens and chickens, but they also had more mouths to feed. Stories survive of city children unused to rural fare, learning to eat swedes and turnips, or helping to gather eggs and milk cows. For some, it was their first taste of farm work, their first real understanding that food came from soil and animals, not simply from shops. The black market, though frowned upon, grew during these years. A few extra eggs, a piece of bacon, a pat of butter, these were treasures, traded quietly between neighbors or sold in whispered transactions behind shops. Authorities tried to crack down, but enforcement was difficult. For families facing hardship, the temptation was strong. In some places, generosity and barter softened the edges. Neighbors shared garden produce, swapped jam for potatoes, or pooled rations to create something special for a wedding or birthday. The government understood that morale was as important as nutrition. To keep spirits high, the Ministry of Food ran cheerful campaigns. Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete, cartoon figures, smiled from posters, urging families to eat their vegetables proudly. Radio programs such as The Kitchen Front gave advice, blending practicality with encouragement. There was a sense that everyone was in it together, from the humblest family to the royal household. King George VI's ration book was even displayed publicly, a symbol of shared sacrifice. Meanwhile, abroad, rationing looked different. In the Soviet Union, where German invasion had devastated farmland, shortages were even harsher. In besieged Leningrad, rations sank to starvation levels. A few ounces of bread each day, sometimes made with sawdust mixed into the flour. In Germany, rationing was strict but less equal, with preference often given to soldiers. Across occupied Europe, people adapted in countless ways, bartering, foraging, smuggling, and improvising with whatever could be found. Back in Britain, creativity in the kitchen became almost an art form. Housewives turned leftovers into entirely new meals. Nothing was wasted. Potato peelings were fried into crisps. Dripping, the fat left from cooking meat, was saved to spread on bread. Children grew accustomed to flavors that today might seem bland or unappealing, but at the time they were accepted as the flavor of endurance. Even holidays were reshaped by rationing. Christmas dinners were modest, often featuring homegrown vegetables instead of lavish roasts. Birthday cakes might be small, made with dried fruit or sweetened with grated carrots. Weddings became acts of community, friends contributing their sugar coupons so that a proper cake could be baked, even if decorated with cardboard icing to save on ingredients. These small gestures carried enormous weight, symbols of love and hope during years of strain. To imagine these times is to imagine resilience in the face of limitation. A woman in a small terraced house, carefully measuring out sugar for the week. A father working long hours in a factory, his lunch a simple sandwich wrapped in paper. Children playing in the garden, pulling up carrots planted months before, their laughter mixing with the sound of distant aircraft. The war was fought with tanks and guns, but it was also fought in kitchens, with wooden spoons and ration books, with patience and determination. By the late stages of the war, people had become experts at survival. The cues, the coupons, the monotony of meals, all had become woven into life's fabric. Yet underneath, there remained a quiet hunger, not always hunger of the stomach, but hunger of memory, for flavors remembered from before the war, for freedom to eat without counting ounces. Families dreamed of bananas, of chocolate, of meals served without the ration book's careful accounting. And so the question lingered in many minds. When the war finally ended, would life return to normal? Would the shops once again overflow with bread, butter, and fruit? Or would rationing remain, its habits too deeply carved into the nation to fade quickly? Section 3. The war ended in 1945, but the ration book did not vanish with victory. For millions, that came as a surprise. After years of sacrifice, people expected a return to plenty. Grocers' shelves stocked, ships free to sail, imports flowing again. Instead, rationing tightened. In some respects, it grew even stricter than during the war itself. The reason was simple. Europe lay in ruins. Farmland across the continent was devastated. Transport networks shattered and economies drained. Britain, though spared invasion, was financially exhausted. Victory had come at a high price. Ships and resources still went abroad to feed hungry populations in occupied lands, to support the rebuilding of allies, to sustain troops still stationed overseas. At home, the ration book remained the law of the kitchen. Meat, which had been scarce during the war, stayed limited for nearly a decade after. The national loaf, gray, heavy, and unpopular, remained a staple. Even bread, once thought too sacred to ration, was finally brought under strict control in 1946, to the dismay of families who had hoped for relief. Sugar, cheese, fats, and sweets all stayed measured out in ounces and coupons. In fact, one of the most famous moments of post-war rationing was the fleeting return of bananas. Children who had grown up never tasting one were suddenly treated to the exotic yellow fruit when the first shipments arrived. Long queues formed, and bananas disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared. For many, the taste was unforgettable, sharp, sweet, and almost overwhelming after years of monotony. Parents sometimes sacrificed their share, giving their children the entire fruit. It was a memory that stayed vivid for decades. Holidays were still modest affairs. Christmas cakes relied on dried fruit, if it could be found, or inventive substitutes. Chocolate was rationed until 1947, and sweets more broadly until 1953. Weddings continued to rely on friends and family pooling coupons. A bride's dress might be made from parachute silk, if one could be obtained, the material repurposed from the war itself. In this way, the line between wartime and peace blurred. The habits of frugality and creativity continued, even as bombs no longer fell. Government campaigns, too, continued. The Ministry of Food carried on producing leaflets, radio shows, and posters. The cheerful faces of Potato Pete and Dr. Carrot still encouraged citizens to make the most of what they had. Even the royal family remained subject to rationing. Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, famously saved up her coupons to purchase the fabric for Princess Elizabeth's wedding dress in 1947. It was meant as a powerful symbol. No one, not even royalty, was exempt from the rules. But rationing was not simply about controlling supply. It had lasting social effects. It narrowed the gap between rich and poor, at least in terms of diet. For once, everyone ate much the same: the national loaf, powdered eggs, carrots, and potatoes. The wealthy might still have found ways around the rules, but in general, the diet of a duke and a dock worker looked remarkably similar. Malnutrition in children actually declined during the rationing years, since food was distributed more evenly than in the free market of pre-war Britain. Doctors noted that many children were healthier in the 1940s than they had been in the 1930s, despite shortages. The shared experience also created a cultural memory. Families remembered queuing together, stretching meals, and finding joy in small treats. The sound of a kettle whistling, the smell of cabbage boiling, the careful unwrapping of sugar paper. These became symbols of endurance. Even decades later, older generations spoke of rationing not simply with frustration, but with pride. They had survived, they had adapted, they had built a sense of community from scarcity. Still, there was deep weariness. By the late 1940s, the phrase "austerity Britain" captured the national mood. Clothes were patched and repatched. Shoes were mended again and again. Families dreamed of freedom not only in politics but in their kitchens and cupboards. Slowly, changes came. In 1949, clothing rationing ended. In 1950, the first signs of food relief appeared. By 1954, meat and bacon were finally free from the ration book. And with that, the system that had shaped life for nearly 14 years came to an end. For children born in the late 1930s or early 1940s, rationing had been all they knew. To shop without coupons, to buy a sweet without counting. It was almost unimaginable. Their first taste of abundance was both thrilling and unsettling. In later life, many of these same people carried habits of thrift well into adulthood. They saved scraps, disliked waste, and approached food with gratitude. In kitchens across Britain, "Waste not, want not" became a lasting family motto. Other countries had their own post-war rationing tales. In Germany, food shortages persisted well into the 1950s, especially in the bombed-out cities of the West. In Japan, rice was carefully measured, and black markets thrived until the economy recovered. Even in the United States, where rationing had been less severe, veterans returned home to find limits on sugar and gasoline still in place for a time. Globally, the war's shadow lingered on the dinner table. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the hardship, the queues, the bland meals, the never-ending coupons. Yet rationing also revealed something enduring about human resilience. Families discovered that they could endure monotony, that they could adapt to less, that meals were not only about food but about togetherness. A sandwich of national loaf eaten in a bomb shelter carried as much meaning as a feast at a grand table. Perhaps more. Today, when supermarket shelves overflow, the idea of a ration book seems distant. Yet the memories still echo. In Britain, older generations sometimes recall the thrill of their first banana, or the taste of sweets finally free of coupons. In other parts of the world, rationing remains a living memory, tied to survival in times of war or economic crisis. And in every case, it asks the same quiet question. What truly sustains us when abundance disappears? Was it the bread, the potatoes, the milk carefully poured? Or was it the patience, the sharing, the willingness to endure together? That question, still open, still worth reflecting on, lingers long after the ration book was closed. And here, we close the story of rationing, with its gray bread, its careful coupons, and its quiet endurance. Story 4. The Life of Monks in Medieval Europe. Prayer, Silence, and Daily Routine. Section 1. If you were to step into medieval Europe at almost any point between the 9th and the 15th centuries, you would find monasteries scattered across the landscape like islands of stillness in a restless world. Castles might echo with the clang of weapons, towns might hum with trade, but monasteries breathed a different rhythm. Slow, measured, timeless. Inside their stone walls, men dedicated their lives not to wealth, nor to war, nor to family, but to prayer. They lived by strict rules, often the rule of Saint Benedict, which prescribed exactly how a monk should spend each hour of the day. It was a world of order, of repetition, of silence, and yet, within that apparent monotony, an entire universe of meaning. The day of a medieval monk began in darkness. Long before the sun rose, the bells rang through cloisters and dormitories, calling the community to matins. It might be 2 in the morning, sometimes even earlier. The brothers stirred from their wooden beds, pulling on simple woolen habits. Sleep was cut short, deliberately so, for to deny oneself comfort was to move closer to God. In the cold chapel, by flickering candlelight, the monks gathered. Their voices, chanting psalms in Latin, rose into the air, steady and solemn. No instruments accompanied them, only the pure flow of human voices, weaving sacred words into the night. For listeners today, such chant has a hypnotic, dreamlike quality, but for the monks it was a discipline. The psalms were memorized, repeated, and recited, until the rhythm of prayer soaked into their bones. After matins came a short rest, then another service. Lauds, greeting the dawn. By now the sky had softened into gray. Birds stirred outside, and within the chapel the monks prayed again. Thus began the cycle of the hours, fixed times of prayer that divided their entire existence. To modern eyes, the routine might seem monotonous, yet monotony was the point. Repetition stripped away distraction. Each day was not meant to be unique, but to echo eternity. By shaping every hour, the monks sought to shape their souls. Between the hours, monks worked. Work, too, was prayer. In Benedictine monasteries, labor was considered holy, a way to avoid idleness, which the rule declared to be the enemy of the soul. Some tilled fields, tending sheep, planting herbs, or digging ditches. Others worked as scribes, hunched over wooden desks in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts by hand, their pens scratched across parchment, illuminating letters with red and gold, preserving texts that might otherwise have vanished from history. The scriptorium was cold, lit by small windows, the air heavy with the scent of ink and vellum. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional cough or the shifting of robes. Yet this quiet labor kept knowledge alive. Without it, many classical texts, works of Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, might have been lost forever. Monks copied them with the same care they gave to Bibles and prayer books, considering all learning, when rightly ordered, a gift of God. Meals were plain, eaten in silence. Bread, pottage, beans, sometimes fish, rarely meat, water or weak ale to drink. A monk's diet was not designed for pleasure, but for sustenance. Even at the table, the rule of silence held. Instead of conversation, a single brother read aloud from a book, scripture, a sermon, or the life of a saint. Thus, nourishment of the body was paired with nourishment of the soul. Silence itself was central. Many monasteries observed strict vows of silence, where speech was permitted only at certain times or in certain places. Instead, monks communicated with simple hand signals. Silence turned their daily lives into a kind of meditation, a constant reminder that words should serve truth, not vanity. To walk through a cloister was to hear not chatter, but footsteps on stone, the rustle of robes, the turning of pages. The architecture of monasteries reflected this rhythm. A square cloister surrounded by covered walkways offered space for meditation. The church, tall and echoing, was the heart of the complex. Dormitories, refectories, scriptoria, and cellars all clustered around. Gardens grew herbs for medicine, vegetables for food, and flowers for the glory of God. Every corner of the monastery was ordered, purposeful, shaped to the life of prayer. For those who entered, it was a total commitment. To become a monk was to leave behind family, property, and ambition. Monks renounced personal possessions. Even their robes were owned by the community. They promised obedience, chastity, and stability, to remain in the monastery until death. In exchange, they gained a life of order, a community bound by shared devotion, and the hope of spiritual progress. Yet, beneath the stillness, there were tensions. Monks were human, not angels. They grew weary, bored, even resentful at times. Records survive of monks grumbling about the strictness of the rules, or sneaking food into their cells. Some monasteries became wealthy through donations, owning vast lands and exploiting peasants, a contradiction to the ideal of simplicity. Critics accused monks of hypocrisy, of growing fat while preaching poverty. Reforms were needed again and again, pulling the monastic life back toward its original vision. Still, the enduring attraction of monasticism lay in its rhythm: prayer, work, silence, study, a life stripped of distraction. For many, it was a path to peace, even holiness. In a chaotic world of warlords, invasions, and plague, the monastery offered stability, a place where the days did not tumble in disorder but unfolded with measured calm. Imagine, for a moment, walking into such a world. The air smells faintly of beeswax and wood smoke. The stones are cool beneath your hand. A bell rings, slow and solemn. Robes brush past as brothers file toward the chapel. In their faces you see not excitement, not weariness, but something else, a kind of resignation, a steady acceptance that this too is prayer. The question that lingers, though, is this: what drew so many to such a life? Why, in an age when survival was hard enough, did men willingly embrace even greater hardship? Section 2. If prayer was the heartbeat of the monastery, then work was its steady breath. To live as a monk meant more than rising in darkness for matins or chanting psalms by candlelight. It also meant hours of labor, woven between the bells, all considered holy because it was done in service to God. The rule of Saint Benedict, written centuries earlier, commanded balance: ora et labora, pray and work. This simple phrase captured the entire monastic vision. Neither prayer without labor nor labor without prayer, but both in harmony. The monastery's fields stretched beyond its stone walls. Monks worked the soil, planting barley, oats, and wheat. They tended sheep for wool, cattle for milk, and bees for honey. In doing so, they not only sustained themselves but shaped the rural economy. Many villages depended on monastic lands, paying rents or working the fields in exchange for protection and stability. The monastery was more than a spiritual center. It was an agricultural engine, a hub of production in a fragile world. Herb gardens flourished within cloister walls. Rows of sage, rosemary, fennel, and lavender grew under careful hands. These were not only for flavoring simple meals, but for medicine. Monks became keepers of herbal knowledge, blending remedies for fevers, stomach aches, wounds, and infections. Manuscripts such as the Herbarium Apulae or the Taquinum Sanitatis were copied and preserved in monasteries, ensuring that practical knowledge of plants endured through centuries. A monk in the infirmary might prepare a salve of honey and vinegar, or boil herbs into a bitter drink to ease pain. Primitive by modern standards, perhaps, but often the best care available at the time. Then there was the scriptorium, the quiet heart of learning. Picture the scene: a long wooden desk, a narrow window spilling thin light, a monk bent over parchment, quill in hand. The scratching of ink is the only sound. Hours stretch into days, days into weeks, as the monk slowly copies a text. Each letter is carefully formed, each page decorated with red ink or gold leaf. Mistakes are rare, but when they happen, they are corrected with sharp knives, scraping the surface of the parchment smooth before rewriting. It was painstaking, exhausting work. Yet from such labor flowed the preservation of entire civilizations. Classical texts survived not by accident, but because monks, generation after generation, copied them. Aristotle's philosophy, Virgil's poetry, Galen's medical writings, all found their way through the scriptorium. Without this hidden devotion, much of ancient knowledge might have vanished in the chaos of Europe's so-called Dark Ages. And, of course, the Bible was central. Copies of Scripture were multiplied, adorned with elaborate illuminations, swirls of color, images of saints, vines curling through letters. These illuminated manuscripts, though rare, still exist today in museums and libraries, testaments to the patient artistry of monks who labored not for fame, but for God. The monastery was also a place of charity. Travelers, pilgrims, and the poor often found shelter within its gates. Benedict's rule commanded hospitality. All guests who present themselves are to be received as Christ. A weary stranger, arriving at a monastery gate after miles on the road, might be offered bread, ale, and a place to sleep. Hospitals attached to monasteries treated not only monks, but the sick from nearby villages. During times of famine, monks distributed food from their stores. During plague, they prayed over the dying, often at the risk of their own lives. This charitable role gave monasteries deep influence in society. Villagers looked to them not only as spiritual guides, but as sources of practical aid. Even lords and kings relied on monastic scribes for record-keeping and administration. Monasteries became guardians of memory, their archives filled with charters, deeds, and chronicles. Many of our earliest records of medieval events come from monastic writers who carefully recorded battles, coronations, and famines, alongside lists of abbots and accounts of harvests. But influence came with wealth, and wealth brought danger. Over time, donations of land and money made many monasteries rich. Their barns filled, their cellars stocked, their coffers heavy. Critics pointed out the contradiction. Men who had sworn poverty overseeing estates larger than those of many nobles. Reform movements sprang up, Cistercians in the 12th century, for instance, insisting on a return to simplicity. They built monasteries in remote valleys, wore undyed wool, and emphasized hard manual labor over comfort. Their white habits contrasted with the black of the Benedictines, earning them the nickname White Monks. Even within Reformed orders, however, the tension remained. To survive, monasteries needed income. To preserve knowledge, they needed resources. To give charity, they needed wealth. The line between necessity and excess was always thin. And yet, despite failures, the image of monks as men of prayer, work, and silence persisted, and often inspired. Daily rhythm continued, unbroken. Prime, terce, sext, none. The hours of prayer, chanted at fixed times. Work in the fields, work in the scriptorium, work in the kitchen. Meals eaten in silence, scripture read aloud. Evening vespers, then compline, prayers before bed. A day framed by bells, a life framed by discipline. Each monk had his own struggle, with fatigue, with distraction, with the longing for family or the temptation of the world outside. Yet together they carried on. To a modern listener, their days might sound impossibly dull, yet within that dullness lay something powerful, freedom from constant choice. In a monastery, life was already decided. The bell told you when to rise, when to pray, when to work, when to eat. All that remained was to surrender to the rhythm, to let the repetition carry you. Consider the paradox. In their silence, monks became the loudest voices of their age. In their poverty, they became custodians of immense wealth, cultural, intellectual, and spiritual. In their isolation, they touched the lives of peasants, nobles, kings, and even generations yet unborn. Their simple meals and worn habits concealed a legacy that would shape Europe itself. And so the question arises, was this influence the result of divine design or of human discipline? Did monasteries flourish because God blessed their devotion, or because their structured way of life proved more resilient than the chaos around them? Section 3. Every life has a cycle, and so do institutions. Just as a monk's day rose with matins in darkness and closed with compline at night, so too did the centuries of monastic power rise and fall. What began as a movement of radical simplicity, men fleeing the world to live in prayer and poverty, eventually became entangled in the very structures it sought to escape. By the later Middle Ages, monasteries were everywhere in Europe. Their spires rose above valleys, their bells marked the passage of time in villages. Their lands stretched wide, their libraries grew heavy with manuscripts. Yet alongside devotion came criticism. Some monks, people whispered, had grown comfortable. Meals became richer, silence less strict, discipline more relaxed. The very wealth that had allowed monasteries to thrive now became their burden. Preachers thundered against excess. Reformers urged a return to the true spirit of monasticism. Orders rose and fell in cycles of renewal. The Cistercians of the 12th century had once been radical in their austerity, yet within a century they too were accused of softness. The Carthusians, another strict order, demanded even greater silence and solitude, retreating almost entirely from the world. Always the tension returned. How to balance poverty with power, solitude with service. Outside the cloister walls, society changed. Towns grew, universities rose, merchants prospered. Knowledge that had once been preserved only in monasteries began to flow through cities, copied by professional scribes and printed after the 15th century by the new invention of the press. What had once made monks indispensable, their scriptoria, their libraries, became less central. Books no longer depended on candlelit hands alone. Then came storms of even greater force. In the 16th century, the Reformation swept across Europe. Reformers like Martin Luther, himself once a monk, denounced monastic vows as unnecessary, even unbiblical. Across Protestant lands, monasteries were dissolved, their lands confiscated, their buildings turned to other uses. In England, King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s was dramatic and swift. Thousands of monks were expelled, treasures stripped, libraries scattered, stone cloisters dismantled. Some monasteries crumbled into ruins. Others became manor houses, schools, or parish churches. The rhythm of bells that had once ordered entire communities fell silent. For peasants and villagers, it was a profound change. No longer did they bring grain to the abbey mill, or gather herbs from the cloister garden, or hear the monks chanting at dawn. The world shifted, and with it, 1,000 years of tradition seemed to vanish. Yet not all was lost. In Catholic Europe, monasteries endured, though often on smaller scales. Benedictines, Cistercians, Franciscans, Dominicans. These communities adapted, finding new roles in education, missionary work, or scholarship. Even today, monasteries still exist, their walls echoing with chant, their gardens growing herbs, their libraries storing books. Though never again as central as they had once been, the monastic ideal never fully disappeared. What remained, above all, was their legacy. Monks had preserved knowledge through centuries of upheaval. They had recorded history in chronicles, kept alive the art of healing, and offered refuge to the poor. Their manuscripts still rest in libraries from Oxford to Rome, each letter a trace of a life bent over parchment centuries ago. Their ruins, scattered across Europe, speak of lives once lived in silence and prayer, their arches open to sky and wind, yet still filled with quiet power. In many ways, monasteries shaped how we imagine the Middle Ages. When we picture a cloister garden, a cowled figure in shadow, a candle flickering in the scriptorium, we are seeing not only history, but also memory. Fragments of a life both ordinary and extraordinary. The dull details of daily routine, bells, bread, silence, parchment, built the foundation of a culture. Without them, Europe would have been poor in knowledge, poor in faith, poor in endurance. And so we return to the rhythm of the hours, the endless cycle of prayer and work. To the monk, each day was simply another step toward eternity. To us, centuries later, each of those days adds up to a legacy that cannot be forgotten. But here, too, a question lingers. When we think of silence, discipline, and devotion, do we see them as relics of a vanished world, or as something still needed today? In an age of noise and speed, perhaps the monks' greatest gift is not their manuscripts or their stone cloisters, but their reminder that time can be lived slowly, deliberately, with purpose. And so the bells of the monastery fade, their echoes carrying us out of the cloister, leaving behind the hush of centuries. Story 5. The Plague Years, Daily Life. During the Black Death section 1, you might be lying in your bed now. The room quiet, perhaps the clock ticking gently in the background. It's easy to forget how fragile life once was. Today, we drift to sleep with the comfort of knowing tomorrow will likely arrive much the same as today. But in the 14th century, across the villages and cities of Europe, people went to sleep each night with uncertainty, wondering if they or their families would live to see the morning. The Black Death, the Great Plague, arrived with frightening suddenness in 1347. Carried by trade ships across the Mediterranean, the disease swept from port to port, leaving behind trails of sickness and silence. At first, it was only whispers. A strange illness in Messina, Sicily. Ships returning from the east carrying men fevered and dying. But soon, whispers became panic. By 1348, the plague had spread across much of Europe, moving faster than any army, more devastating than any war. To you, the listener, this might sound like a distant and dramatic moment in history. But imagine it not as a sweeping headline, but as ordinary days lived by ordinary people. That's what we'll explore here. Not just the numbers, not just the great tragedies, but the small, often overlooked details of daily life under plague. Imagine a small village. Narrow streets, houses built of wood and stone, animals wandering freely between doorways, the air thick with smoke from hearths, the ground muddy from rain. In such a place, people had little defense against a sickness that no one understood. There were no doctors as we know them today, no hospitals ready with modern cures. Knowledge of disease was limited to theories of bad air or imbalances of the body's humors. When the first signs of illness appeared, fever, swellings, blackened skin, families often tried to hide it, hoping it would pass. To admit plague was to invite fear, quarantine, even abandonment. Mothers watched over children with worry, while fathers debated whether to stay or flee. Some locked themselves inside, closing shutters, burning herbs, and praying. Others left entirely, abandoning homes in search of safety. But the plague moved everywhere. Safety was an illusion. Let's pause here. Picture yourself walking through a medieval street in those years. A bell tolls in the distance, not for time, but for death. The sound is constant, unending. Funeral processions wind slowly through the lanes, priests chanting as they lead carts piled with bodies. The smell of decay mixes with wood smoke and damp earth. People move quickly, heads lowered, avoiding contact. Even greetings, once a gesture of friendship, became dangerous. Daily life shrank. Markets, once lively with trade and chatter, grew quiet. Stalls closed. Bread became scarce. Farmers, too sick to work, left fields unplowed. In towns, the absence of workers meant trades slowed. Shops shuttered, inns emptied. What was once routine, baking bread, fetching water, mending clothes, became marked with dread. Every errand risked exposure. Every cough stirred fear. And yet, life did not stop entirely. Children still played in streets, though under watchful eyes. Families still gathered for meals, often smaller and simpler than before. Women still spun wool. Men still repaired tools. The weight of death pressed down. But beneath it, people clung to fragments of the familiar. Survival, in part, meant holding on to routine. Religion offered both comfort and confusion. Churches overflowed with those seeking God's mercy. Priests led processions, carrying relics, chanting prayers. Some believed the plague was divine punishment for sins, and so communities turned to confession, repentance, and fasting. Others sought scapegoats, blaming outsiders, strangers, or marginalized groups. Fear, unchecked, bred suspicion. At the same time, certain extreme movements rose. The flagellants, bands of men who wandered town to town whipping themselves, believed their suffering would atone for humanity's sins and end the plague. Their chants echoed through the streets, their bodies marked with blood, as onlookers watched in silence or joined in desperate hope. For some, it was faith. For others, madness. But faith was not the only response. Some turned away from religion entirely. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, became the creed of many who lost hope. Taverns filled, music played, laughter spilled into the night, a defiant refusal to live in fear. In such moments, daily life under plague carried strange contradictions: mourning and celebration, despair and resilience, silence and music. And through it all, the social fabric strained. Neighbors no longer trusted neighbors. Families sometimes abandoned the sick to protect the healthy. Rich fled to countryside estates, leaving the poor to face the plague alone. Doctors offered remedies of herbs, charms, and poultices, yet often fell ill themselves. Trust eroded, replaced by isolation. The bonds of community, so vital in medieval life, frayed in the face of invisible threat. Still, human beings adapt. Even amid horror, survival meant finding new ways to endure. People cleansed their homes with fire, fumigating rooms with rosemary and juniper. Windows were open to let air circulate. Clothing was washed more often, sometimes boiled in vinegar. Herbs were carried in pouches, pressed to noses in crowded places. None of it cured the plague, but it gave people a sense of action, a way to resist helplessness. The plague years reshaped even the way people thought about time. Death was so present that the future seemed uncertain. Wills were written quickly, sometimes the same day symptoms appeared. Property changed hands rapidly. Fortunes made and lost in weeks. Villages lost entire generations. Children inherited lands from parents, only to die themselves, passing it to distant relatives. The normal rhythm of inheritance and succession collapsed under the weight of mortality. And yet, in the long silence of these years, something deeper also took root. People began to question not only how to survive, but why. If the world could be so fragile, what truly mattered? Was it wealth, property, comfort? Or was it something else? Community, memory, faith, even simple endurance. It's strange, isn't it? From the outside, the Black Death seems like one great tragedy, a dark shadow over Europe. But when you look closely, you see it was also 1,000 small daily struggles. The mother tending a fevered child, the farmer burying his neighbor, the priest ringing the bell for yet another funeral. Each act, ordinary and quiet, was a part of the larger story. And so, as we close this first section, you may ask yourself, what did survival truly look like in these years? Was it just about escaping death, or was it also about clinging to meaning, even when the world seemed emptied of it? Dew, Section 2. When a storm passes, the world it leaves behind is never the same. The Black Death did not sweep through Europe once and vanish. It lingered in waves, flaring again and again in smaller outbreaks across decades. But even in the midst of its devastation, people began to rebuild. The story of the plague is not only one of death, it is also one of adaptation, change, and strange new beginnings. Picture the fields after those first terrible years. Many villages had been emptied entirely, their cottages abandoned, roofs sagging, weeds creeping over paths once trampled daily by footsteps. In some cases, churches stood deserted, their bells silent, their doors chained. But in other places, life slowly returned. Survivors emerged from shuttered homes, neighbors gathered again in cautious circles, and the fields were tilled once more. The work of rebuilding was heavy, but necessity drove it forward. Grain still needed to be grown, bread still baked, wool still spun. Yet something fundamental had shifted. There were fewer hands to do the work. Where once a manor lord had dozens of peasants bound to his land, now only a handful remained. The great reduction in population became the seed of deep social and economic change. For centuries, Europe had been bound by the system of feudalism. Lords owned the land, peasants labored on it, and rents or duties were owed as part of the rigid order. But after the plague, that order began to wobble. With so many dead, peasants suddenly found themselves in demand. Landowners, desperate for workers, offered better terms. Lighter rents, even wages in coin rather than obligation. Some peasants moved to new villages, bargaining for better conditions. Others simply refused to return to the old burdens. To the listener today, this might seem like a slow, quiet shift. But to those who lived it, it was revolutionary. The balance of power tilted, if only slightly, from lord to laborer. Survivors who had once lived at the edge of subsistence found new opportunities. Families who endured gained access to abandoned lands or inherited property unexpectedly. The rigid hierarchy of medieval life cracked, even if only in places. This shift did not go unnoticed by rulers. Kings and nobles, anxious to preserve their power, issued laws to hold back change. In England, for instance, the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349 and the Statute of Laborers in 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind workers to their lords once more. But laws are only as strong as the will to enforce them. Across Europe, workers pushed back, quietly or openly, against efforts to turn back the tide. The seeds of future revolts, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, were planted in these years. And so, from the silence of death came voices of resistance. Not loud, not immediate, but steady. Daily life in the villages now included not only tending fields, but also calculating possibilities. Should one stay loyal to a lord, or seek better terms elsewhere? Should one accept the new wages offered, or move again in search of more. In this quiet weighing of choices, Europe was slowly reshaped. In towns, the plague reshaped commerce as well. Fewer craftsmen meant greater demand for their skills. Apprentices could rise to master status more quickly. Guilds, once tightly regulated, found themselves struggling to maintain standards as gaps in membership appeared. Shops reopened, but with new faces at their counters. The rhythm of daily trade, bakers kneading dough, cobblers hammering leather, butchers hanging cuts of meat, returned, but beneath it ran currents of change. Markets also shifted. With fewer mouths to feed, food prices sometimes dropped, but wages, when they were allowed to rise, gave survivors more purchasing power. Some families who had always struggled could now afford more varied diets. Meat, once rare on a peasant's table, appeared more often. Dairy products became staples. Even clothing changed, as wool and linen became more accessible. The dull routines of shopping, eating, and dressing carried quiet signs of transformation. Religion, too, adjusted in the aftermath. The church had been central during the height of plague, but its failures left deep marks. Priests had died in large numbers, and many parishes were left without spiritual leaders. Replacement clergy were often younger and less trained, and their presence did not inspire the same reverence. Doubt crept in. People still prayed, still attended Mass, but their trust in the Church's absolute power had been shaken. New forms of devotion grew. Some turned to more personal practices: private prayer, small altars in homes, pilgrimages to local shrines. Mystics rose in prominence, offering visions and words of comfort. Confraternities, groups of lay people bound by devotion and charity, took on roles once filled by monasteries or clergy. Slowly, religious life became more diverse, more fractured, less controlled from above. The long shadow of these shifts would stretch into later centuries, setting the stage for even greater upheavals. Beyond faith and economy, the plague altered even how people thought about death itself. Before, mortality had always been part of life. Wars, famine, and disease were familiar companions. But the Black Death forced death into daily consciousness on a scale never before experienced. Artists began to depict the dance macabre, the dance of death, showing skeletons leading people of all ranks, from kings to peasants, in a grim procession. These images reminded all that death was universal, a leveler of society. Gravestones, too, reflected this new awareness. Inscriptions grew more personal, more urgent, as if the living wanted to send messages across the gap between worlds. Families, scarred by loss, placed greater emphasis on remembering the dead. The rituals of burial shifted. Mass graves became more common during outbreaks, but in calmer years, there was renewed care for individual remembrance. To live in post-plague Europe was to live with death not only as a threat, but as a constant companion in art, faith, and memory. Yet, amid this shadow, daily resilience shone through. Life did not remain paralyzed forever. Festivals returned. Marriages were celebrated. Children were born. Laughter rang out in courtyards once again. Human beings, fragile though they are, carry remarkable endurance. The survivors of the plague years did not simply mourn. They planted, built, sang, and dreamed once more. Perhaps this is one of the most boring truths of history, that even in the wake of disaster, much of daily life looks ordinary. People still worried about bread rising in the oven, about clothes wearing thin, about whether the rain would come in time for crops. The plague was an extraordinary event, but the lives lived through it were stitched together from small, steady acts of persistence. And yet another question emerges. Did this great suffering also plant seeds of future possibility? If peasants gained new freedoms, if towns shifted toward new economies, if faith loosened from rigid forms, then perhaps the Black Death was not only an ending, but also a beginning. Dew, Section 2. When a storm passes, the world it leaves behind is never the same. The Black Death did not sweep through Europe once and vanish. It lingered in waves, flaring again and again in smaller outbreaks across decades. But even in the midst of its devastation, people began to rebuild. The story of the plague is not only one of death, it is also one of adaptation, change, and strange new beginnings. Picture the fields after those first terrible years. Many villages had been emptied entirely, their cottages abandoned, roofs sagging, weeds creeping over paths once trampled daily by footsteps. In some cases, churches stood deserted, their bells silent, their doors chained. But in other places, life slowly returned. Survivors emerged from shuttered homes, neighbors gathered again in cautious circles, and the field